to welcome everyone to our discussion tonight about Yahrzeit. But first of all, I would like to thank our sponsors. We have four sponsors tonight of this year. So we're going to start off by thanking Ken and Lisa Kantorowitz, who are sponsoring to commemorate the Yahrzeit of Lisa's grandmother, Marianne Swirsky, Miriam Bat Simchadan, and Yocheved. So the Neshama Shavan Aliyah. So we do thank you. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Lisa. We'd also like to thank Susan Jerkowitz, who's sponsoring to commemorate the Yahrzeit of her cousin, Dr. George Biro. Rosh Chodesh Teves was the Yahrzeit. Neshama Shavan Aliyah. Thank you, Susan, for the sponsorship. We also would like to thank Abe and Eva Kaplan, who are sponsoring to commemorate the Yahrzeit of Abe's mother, Sarah Bat Chaim Vebraina, Zichrona Livracha, Neshama Shavan Aliyah. Thank you so much, all the way from Los Angeles. And we would also like to thank Tommy and Susan Jutkovich. It's to commemorate the Yahrzeit of Tommy's father, Isidor Jutkovich, Yisrael Tzvi Ben Aria, also Rosh Chodesh Teves, Zichrona Livracha, and Susan's father, Elias Silverman, Elio Arya Bedov HaKohan. So we thank you, and may the neshamas all benefit from our words of Torah that we're going to be studying here today. And we're going to be discussing a Yahrzeit. And for anyone who I would call the Yahrzeit an experience, it's an experience. It's a significant day. It is a day that brings back lots of feelings. And our goal tonight will be to try to understand a little bit what the Yahrzeit is really about, what we should be doing, what we should be thinking, what we should be focusing on, and going through traditional texts to the best of our ability to go ahead and appreciate what this significant day is about. We're going to start off with a story. As many of you know, among the great rabbinic figures of the past few centuries, the Chatam Sofer, Chatam Sofer is one I quote often. He's one of those authorities that I turn to with confidence, that what I'm being informed is not just something that was pulled out of a hat, but something that is based on our tradition, is fundamental. And every word that was uttered by the Chatam Sofer and every word written is a diamond. It's pure Torah. So it's one of those authorities that I feel a deep connection to the Chatam Sofer. So there's a story. It's a true story that's recorded by his descendants, by his children actually. And it works as follows. The Chatam Sofer actually was married 3 times. He had no children from his first wife, who died at an early age. His second wife, the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eger, is the one that the Kenai Nahar, they had a lot of children. I say Kenai Nahar because there are thousands upon thousands of descendants. And after the passing of his second wife, when he was a little bit older already, he married his third wife. Her name was Chaya, or Chayala, not sure which one was the official name, but Chaya. And Chaya was an almana. She was the widow of a great rabbi who originated in Galicia, made his way to Hungary, and some of my best friends are Hungarian. And this rabbi, his name was Rav Tzvi Hirsch Heller. So again, there's a rabbi, a great authority towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century called Rav Tzvi Hirsch Heller, Rabbi Heller. He has descendants who are Weinbergers. I don't know if the Shul Weinbergers or not, but Rabbi Heller is a big name. Rabbi Heller passed away in the early 1830s. His almana, his wife, the widow, Chaya, remarries the Chatam Sofer. And the last few years of his life, he spent with Chaya. And it appears they had a nice relationship. Now, this story we're going to share occurs on the 25th of Tishrei. On the 25th of Tishrei, it was actually the Yahrzeit of Chaya's first husband, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Heller. And it appears that Chaya still felt some connection to her first husband. So she went in a corner of the house where her husband, the Chassam Sofer, Ramosha Sofer, would not notice, or so she thought. And she lit a Yahrzeit candle. Chaya lit a Yahrzeit candle for her previous husband, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Heller. Unfortunately, the Chassam Sofer noticed. He noticed. And as his descendants describe, it had a very unpleasant impact on him psychologically, meaning he was, as I would say in Yiddish, verschrocken. It had some very unpleasant feelings developed within him. However, he realized that the right thing at that moment is to keep quiet, which is an important lesson, that there's often times in life that we have this urge to say something due to intense emotions. We could be inspired by the Chassam Sofer, and he kept quiet. He did not say a word. Now, his descendants note that the date was the 25th of Tishrei, and actually the Chassam Sofer himself a few years later died. He was nifter. He passed away on the 25th of Tishrei. For his descendants, who are very mystical and spiritual, they see something in it. In other words, it is as if he sensed something when he saw that Ner Neshama. That's how they view the story itself. Now, the reason I start off with this story is because it has within it two aspects of what a Yahrzeit is about. Two of them. Number one is the metaphysical, right? The way the descendants view it is that it is as if the Chassam Sofer sensed when he saw that Ner Neshama that it impacts his mazel, whatever that means. But we all agree that there's something metaphysical. We relate to something that is spiritual on a Yahrzeit, right? We remember a parent on a Yahrzeit. It's not something physical. We relate to the neshama. So that's aspect number one of a Yahrzeit. Aspect number two is the significance of emotions. There are a lot of emotions. We remember someone that had an impact on us, really defines who we are. Yahrzeit is a day with a lot of emotions, and as we'll see, the halacha takes that into consideration. So that is why I start off with the story itself, because it gives us perhaps a little bit of a picture of what we're going to be studying as we view the Yahrzeit itself. Now, the word Yahrzeit obviously originates in Yiddish, year, time of year, the time of year. There's a funny story that there was a tremendous rabbi in Baghdad towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. His name was Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, and he was a very significant authority for Iraqi and Persian Jews. He is the authority they turn to, perhaps on the level of the Chassam Sofer for the Hungarians. So Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad was a tremendous Torah scholar. He actually would lecture on every single Shabbos for a couple hours. Everyone would stand and listen. Some incredible stories about him. But he writes the following, that he has a challenge, he has a problem, because he studies a lot of the European literature, Torah literature from European communities, and he sees this word Yahrzeit mentioned often as it relates to the day of passing. But he doesn't know what a Yahrzeit is, meaning in Baghdad, they didn't speak Yiddish. So he didn't know what a Yahrzeit is. So he says that he thought through it, and he came to a conclusion that it must be a Rosh Tevis, it must be an acronym, it must stand for something. So he decided to decipher what the word Yahrzeit means, and he said that it must stand for the following: Yom Asifat Raglei Tzadik, the day of gathering of the feet of the righteous. The term gathering of feet is a biblical term for passing. So he claims that the Yud stands for Yom, Aleph, Asifat, Reish, Raglei, Tzadik, Yortz, Yeh Yom Tov will be a good day. So that's how he decided to decipher the Yahrzeit. He writes afterwards that a few years later he found a source from the 17th century which indicates to him that perhaps I was just creative and actually it's a word in Yiddish. But his earlier thinking of Yom HaSifat Raglei Tzadik, Yeh Yom Tov is original and is one that is appreciated. Fine. So now let's start a little bit regarding Yahrzeit itself. And I'll start with something halachic. Ramosha Isserlis shares with us in Ashkenazi tradition that if a person has a Yahrzeit, the evening before, meaning the nighttime of the Yahrzeit, asur le'echol beseuda, he should not be eating in a festive meeting, meaning if there is a festive meal. Perfect example would be a wedding. A person should not participate in the wedding meal if the following day he has Yahrzeit. In other words, if let's say a person has a Yahrzeit on the 3rd of Teves, so on the eve of the 3rd of Teves, he should not participate in a meal. This is what we are told, and this is actually followed by many. However, there's some authorities that try to find leniency. For example, one of the leniencies presented is that perhaps that this is only true for the first Yahrzeit. Then there are those that say that perhaps this tradition is only true for those who historically would fast on a Yahrzeit, which we'll address soon. Now, why do I start off with this halacha? I had an experience in the past where I was asked a question about going to a wedding where it was the eve of the Yahrzeit. However, the person was aware of the tradition, but at the same time, they felt that if they're not going to be going to the wedding, it will cause some discomfort within the family. It's going to have a negative impact on the shalom, on the peace. So based on that, I found authorities who note that perhaps there is such a tradition, but the tradition of keeping the peace intact is more important. And therefore, you could rely on those who say, for example, that it's only true for the first year. So this is something that I start off with because it gives us the appreciation that, yes, there are traditions. And yes, Yahrzeit is important. But number one, remember what the foundation of Judaism is about, which is shalom. And therefore, I mentioned it because I believe that's how we have to start this discussion. Point number two, before we get into a few more details, the importance of not making the day something external. In other words, make it real. When we have that day called the Yahrzeit, and it's not a coincidence that I'm giving this talk now. I am giving it because God willing, next week I have Yahrzeit for my father, and this message is more for myself than anyone else. That the goal of a Yahrzeit is make it real, make it something that really relates to what our tradition is about, and not something external. And we'll see soon what I am referring to. Now, things are done on a Yahrzeit. We all know about a kelma l'rachamim. We all know about a candle. We're familiar with Kaddish. Now, what we have to keep in mind is that the authorities who talk to us about Yahrzeit and things we do, they address the fact that there are two things we should keep in mind. Number one, we are doing things to benefit the neshama. We are doing things to benefit the soul. It appears that, as our tradition teaches us, there is an entity that lives on even after the physical passing from this world. This entity that we call a neshama somehow reconnects to the physical world on the day of passing. And therefore, good things we do on that day have a positive impact on that entity called neshama. So that's part number one. Do things on the Yahrzeit for neshama. That's number one. Number two, things we do on the Yahrzeit is actually for the sake of the living. In other words, when a person has a Yahrzeit, especially for a parent, the child, it appears, that day becomes significant for them. And the living have a need to get some kind of boost on that day. So there are two parts to the Yahrzeit. Number one, do it for the neshama. And number two, do it for the living. Now, when it comes to things that are needed for the neshama, obviously we need to find traditional sources to guide us. We can't come up with them on our own. So, for example, there's a statement made by the Holy Zohar, and the Zohar, which is a mystical text, tells us that you should know that, yes, the neshama reconnects to the world and reconnects to the children on a Yahrzeit, but actually, this reconnection already starts the Shabbos before the Yahrzeit. Based on that statement that appeared in the Zohar, in the 13th century is when it appeared. Based on that, many have a tradition that they already start doing things this Shabbos before a Yahrzeit. Right? People used to sponsor Kiddush. People would sponsor Shalashudas. Men would be called up to the Torah. Some of them would lead the davening. Among Sephardim, there is a tradition that they actually say the Kaddish starting the Shabbos before the Yahrzeit, all the way to the Yahrzeit. Why? Based on this teaching. So obviously there are sources that indicate there are things we do for the neshama, okay? But as we continue this discussion, let's keep that in mind. There are things for the neshama, there are things for the living. The living also have needs, okay? Now, when I was in yeshiva, so this goes back 31 years ago, the yeshiva studied a tractate called Nedarim, vows, relates to vows. So it's a very deep section of the Talmud to appreciate it. And among those things we study there when it comes to Nedarim, to the vow, which obviously we have sensitivity not to make vows, one of them was a concept called hatfasa. Hatfasa. What is hatfasa? So it works as follows. The concept of the vow is that somehow I have the ability to take that which is 100% permissible and make it prohibited upon me. So I could go ahead and declare that that piece of chocolate, even though it's 100% kosher, I am prohibiting that piece of chocolate upon me. So that's called a neder, a vow. Now, the Talmud notes that a person can actually make a vow by linking the permissible to something prohibited. In other words, if I say that this chocolate should be upon me like the cheeseburger from McDonald's. So just as the cheeseburger from McDonald's is prohibited, I have made a vow and linked the kosher piece of chocolate to the sandwich, to the cheeseburger. And that is known as hatfasa. I'm like tofes, I link it. Now the Talmud notes the following, that a person can make a vow that relates not just to an item, but even to a day. In other words, if I wake up one morning and I feel inspired, the Talmud tells us, and I make the following declaration, that today I'm going to be spiritual and I'm not going to eat basar. I will not be eating meat. Today, I'm not going to be eating meat. Velo eshte yain. Today, I'm not going to be drinking any wine, and I am linking it kiyom shemet bo aviv. In other words, just as the day that my father passed away, on that day, I don't eat meat and I don't drink wine, so too, I want to link today to that day. So what we are being informed there, according to many authorities, is the concept that on the day of the passing of my father, on the day of my father's Yahrzeit, I don't eat meat and don't drink wine. And some authorities see this statement as a source for fasting on a Yahrzeit. Okay? So all this which I presented up until now is to tell you that some find in Talmudic sources the idea of fasting on a Yahrzeit. Now, there's a lot of literature about fasting on a Yahrzeit, a lot. And it appears that I would say up until 200 years ago, it was probably the norm. And I also believe that I could probably interview even people today who continue with that tradition of fasting on a Yahrzeit. So what we're going to first do is try to analyze, why is there such a practice at all? And number two, why is it less common nowadays? I use the words less common. I don't know, perhaps even people here who are participating still have that tradition. But nevertheless, those are the two things I want to do. Why would the Almighty, or why would there be any benefit on fasting on a Yahrzeit? Number two, why is it less common? So the traditional authorities, and I'm mentioning authorities now from 600 years ago already, present two explanations as to why there is a benefit of fasting, a ta'anit, on a Yahrzeit. Number one, tikkun nishmat ha'av o ha'em, tikkun. In other words, as we mentioned earlier, on the Yahrzeit itself, it appears that somehow the soul reconnects to the physical world and reconnects to us, and somehow there's some kind of connection that is taking place between my father and myself on a Yahrzeit, and the soul itself is going through some kind of state that perhaps could benefit from a spiritual boost. So therefore, for the sake of the neshama, I fast. Okay, that's explanation number one. Explanation number two, and as I mentioned earlier, a Yahrzeit is significant for the soul, but it is also significant for the living. Explanation number two, as to why there is a tradition of fasting on a Yahrzeit, is because, and I'm quoting from earlier authorities, Itra le mazle, the mazal, whatever that means, the mazal, it's a hard word to translate. I don't like translating it as luck. That's not Jewish. But there is a concept of mazal, and it appears that there's something of the mazal of the living that's in a difficult state on the Yahrzeit. In other words, due to the fact that it is a day on the calendar, that something painful occurred to me. It occurred, right? A Yahrzeit is a day that we are re-experiencing something that was not easy to deal with. So therefore, we are concerned that perhaps our mazel has been tampered with regarding that day. So therefore, to get that boost and protection, we fast. Okay? So here we have it, two explanations as to why there is a concept of fasting on a Yahrzeit, either for the neshama or for the living. Now, keep that in mind. And now I'm going to introduce to you a statement that originates again with the Chatam Sofer. But beforehand, we're going to have to give an introduction. You know, we always talk about the study of Talmud. And yes, it's extremely important to study Jewish text and Jewish traditions. Not everything in Jewish text is easy to understand. And I don't just mean difficulty to appreciate the concepts, but sometimes there's difficulty because these are things that are not rational. And among those things in Talmudic literature that sometimes we have difficulty understanding the message behind it, relates to demons, shedim. They're mentioned in the Talmud. Many people believed in it at that time. I'm sure if I would interview many good Jews 1600 years ago, they would probably almost all be convinced that demons exist. We, who are more rational, have some level of difficulty with it. The additional difficulty is due to the fact that the Talmud itself tells us at times to avoid specific things, not to have a negative interaction with the demons. In other words, there's a section in the Talmud that tells us that a person should avoid doing things in pairs, avoid zugot. This is a statement in the Talmud. In other words, if you want to drink, don't drink 2 cups. Because if you drink 2, you might be influenced by the demons. Now, this is very difficult text to understand and appreciate it. And different commentators have their own approaches to deal with it. But the Talmud itself, at the end of this discussion, makes a statement, which is a very important statement. And this is what I want you to remember. The Talmud, after mentioning these things that people try to avoid, not to come into negative contact with the demons, with the shadim, the Talmud says, man de lo kapid lo kaptinan. In other words, if there's a person that simply is not concerned about it. In other words, although the Talmud just tells us to avoid drinking 2 cups because of demons, the Talmud ends off by saying, if you yourself are not concerned, don't worry about it. Meaning all these statements and all these guidelines only relate to someone who's worried about it. If you're not worried, ignore it. Man de lo kapid, if you yourself disregard it, so the demons are not going to mess with you anyway. Don't worry about it. So what we are really being told here is that there are things that perhaps part of our tradition is to be concerned, but the reality is you could ignore it. It's all in the mind. Mind over matter, if the matter really exists. You have the ability to simply shove it and make it as something irrelevant. Don't be concerned about it. It is an important statement because later rabbis apply it to a whole series of different practices. And they make the statement, listen, if you're not worried about it, just don't worry about it. I'll give you a few examples. One of them relates to dreams. I think we all dream. Some of us have dreams that are fascinating, but within 2-3 minutes, we forget them. Other people have dreams that they remember for longer. Some people worry about their dreams, right? There are people that they have a bad dream and they're worried about it. So in our tradition, there is actually a way of fixing a dream. I have a siddur here, and the siddur has a section that's called Hatavat Chalom, how to make a dream good, right? There are some things you say in front of 3 people, you give some tzedakah, fine. So dreams, the question is going to be asked, should I worry about them or not? I mean, if my siddur here has a section that actually addresses dreams and provides a formula to fix them and make them good, maybe dreams are something I should be concerned about. Maybe they're real. So you know what halachic authorities say? You know what? Man de lo kapid lo kapdina. And the best way to deal with a bad dream is to say to yourself, it's a dream, move on. Simply, the way the human mind works is that things that impacted you during the day, those are the things that are going to come together in your dream in some kind of mixed up salad. So if they create something that terrifies you, ignore it. Okay, so again, although even in Talmudic literature, they talk about dreams and how to address them and what they symbolize, halachic authorities say, man de lo kapid, ignore it. Okay, another example would be many people are familiar with the fact that there's some kind of tradition that if you have a young lady and she's dating a nice young boy, but the problem is that this young lady has the exact same name as the boy's mother, that it's something to avoid, right? You're familiar with it? Where did that come from? It's not in the Talmud. There was a great rabbi some 850 years ago called Rav Yudah Chassid. And this Rav Yudah Chassid mentions that it's something you avoid. Do you take it seriously? Do you not take it seriously? So in some communities, in some circles, they're very, very concerned about it. And the shidduch would not take place if the names match. Other authorities note, even Ramosha Feinstein, man de lo kapid, if you're not worried about it, don't worry about these things, right? It's not in Talmud. It's not something that, we find our sources in the great scholars of the past. It is something that's mentioned. So, man de lo kapid, lo kapdina. So this is a very, very important rule to remember. The list of areas in Jewish tradition where we find the authorities telling us, if you don't worry about it, include some other things as well. But now I would like to get to the Chatam Sofer. Chatam Sofer shares with us the following. Yes, there is a tradition to fast. There is a tradition to fast on a Yahrzeit. However, let's analyze the two reasons. Chatam Sofer notes that you should know, if you view it as that which is beneficial for the neshama, so clearly it is something that's good to do. In other words, if somehow my father's neshama benefits from me not having breakfast during a Yahrzeit and not lunch, good, that I accept. On the other hand, if you take the approach that the idea of fasting is due to the fact that I am concerned about my mazel, that the living perhaps has a mazel issue on that day, in such a case, says Chatam Sofer, man de lo kapi lo kapdina, that you don't have to worry about. That's all in the mind. You have the ability to ignore it. So what we have just done right now with this statement of the Chatam Sofer is sliced off half of the reason for fasting. If I am not concerned so much about the mazel, if I'm not concerned, Chatam Sofer says no need to fast. Now, it still has the half of benefiting the neshama. And what I would like to do now is present to you in a little bit of an explanation why many do not fast on a Yahrzeit. And the great... Okay, so the first question is a good question that David has. David Wolf wants to know, wait a second, is a Yahrzeit a fast of 24 hours? The tradition of fasting on a Yahrzeit is only from Alot HaShachar, from dawn until dark. In other words, just on Asara B'Teves next week, the fasting is only from dawn until dark. So to the Yahrzeit. That's the tradition. So it's a good question. That is for those who follow the tradition. But now we have to understand why indeed are there many who do not fast. So I'm going to start off by mentioning great rabbinic figures who basically said, you know what, there's something you could do that is more beneficial than fasting. I'll start off with Rabbi Akiva Eger, the great Rabbi Akiva Eger. We're going to have a class on him in 2 weeks from now, God willing. Rabbi Akiva Eger passed away in, I think, 1837, a rabbi in Poznan that had a tremendous influence on German rabbinate, and his Torah studied day in, day out in yeshivot. He says you should know the study of Torah is more valuable than the fasting. And therefore, for Torah scholars who, due to the fact that we are a weaker generation, are not going to be able to retain their same level of Torah scholarship and Torah learning if they do not eat on that day, better eat and study Torah, because the neshama will benefit from the Torah learning. And I personally think that it is really a combination of Chatam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eger. In other words, due to the fact that there are two explanations given for the fasting, one relates to the living and his mazel. Number two relates to the neshama. So if I am someone who doesn't worry about mazel, I don't have to fast. The only reason left for yes fasting is because of the boost that is given to that soul. Sit down and study words of Torah. That gives the boost. That's the way it is viewed. Now, you should know it's not just the Rabbi Akiva Eger. I'll quote a few other authorities. You know that the day of my bar mitzvah, I remember many of the details. It was because it was a Wednesday. And on that day, I was supposed to go to school and bring some soda and some cookies to celebrate in class. However, that day, there was a change in plan. We had at the time, we were living in Israel, and we had as guests some people we knew from Toronto, someone I was very close with, a friend and his father. And the night before, they decided that, you know what, on the day of your bar mitzvah, instead of going to school, let's go on a trip to Bnei Brak and let's visit some great rabbinic authorities. So that was the decision, and therefore I didn't show up on school on the day of my bar mitzvah, and I traveled to Bnei Brak, and I visited some great rabbis. One was Rav Shach. I got a gift from him. The other one, which the influence was very significant on an impressionable 13-year-old, was a visit to Rabbi Yisrael Kanievsky, known as the Stipler. You've heard of Reb Chaim Kanievsky in Bnei Brak, his father. And the reason it made a very significant impression on me was that the few minutes we were sitting there in his office, when there would be a pause and no conversation, he had difficulty in hearing. So to communicate with the Stipler, you had to write things on a piece of paper and he would read it. So during the little bit of a pause, he would be mumbling Mishnayot, meaning he was a person who would not waste a second of his life. And he was always studying. So for the young 13-year-old, that had a very significant impression. Notes this Stipler, now that we've introduced you to this person, this Stipler notes that same idea as Rabbi Akiva Eger. The fasting on a Yahrzeit, is to boost a neshama. There are different ways to do it. For some, it's the study of Torah. For some, by the way, he notes, it's acts of kindness, of chesed. If a person decides that this is going to be a Yahrzeit where I'm going to do for others, I'm going to call others, I'm going to do acts of kindness, whatever they are, acts of tzedakah, those things that boost the neshama have more of a value than the fasting. This is what the Stipler says, and also the Chazon Ish, another great rabbinic authority, notes the same idea. So perhaps this gives us a little bit of an insight why there are those who do not fast. In other words, they take the approach, they're not so worried about their own mazel, and therefore it will not have a negative impact. They want to do for the sake of the neshama, but they go through the list of other good things, which we're going to study a little bit more in detail. You know, there are those who try to do a siyum on a Yahrzeit, and the explanation behind it is that if you complete a tractate, you celebrate with a meal. Once you have a meal, you could continue eating, similar to what we do on Erev Pesach. Now, what I really want to walk away with as we are trying to take things from this discussion is to appreciate the value of limud Torah, the value of Torah study. In other words, you know, I think we all know that Kaddish plays a significant role when it comes to a Yahrzeit. And it was traditional in Europe for people to call their sons, he is my Kaddishal, right? He's the one that's going to say Kaddish. Now, I would like to share with you a fascinating statement, and I'm even going to attempt to share the screen here to show you this statement of when it comes to our discussion as it relates to Kaddish. Do you see this statement here? I hope you do. Okay, now, what I have here in front of you is the tzava'ah, the will of a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yaakov David Wilovsky. Rabbi Wilovsky. He is also known as the Ridvaz. Passed away in 1913, considered a great Torah scholar. He actually had significant debates with Rav Kook, but in a very respectful way. He actually spent a few months in Chicago trying to develop the rabbinate there in the beginning of the 20th century, was not successful. Landed up in Tzfat, and a great Torah leader and a great Torah scholar, wrote on the Jerusalem Talmud. And he shares the following in his will to his children, meaning the tzava'ah, basically how he's commanding his children to live on after his passing. And he writes the following. He says to them, Hizaharu, my dear children, be careful. Biyom, on a day, Shetomru Kaddish, on the day that you want to say a Kaddish for me on my Yahrzeit, be careful. Lilmod daf Gemara b'zeh hayom. Be sure to study a page of Talmud. Study of Torah, that's what we are about. That's our essence, the study of Torah. And then he says, Ve'im, and if you chas v'shalom, if God forbid, there's going to be eze siba, there's going to be any reason, v'tevatzlu hashiur, if for whatever reason you are not able to study that day, tizaru me'od me'od shelo lomar kaddish b'zeh hayom klal. Don't dare say a Kaddish, because you should know to say a Kaddish, to say the Kaddish without the study of Torah, lo ta'asu nachat ruach lanishmati. You're not going to be benefiting my soul at all. Be'omrechem Kaddish be'lo limud daf Gemara b'zeh hayom. Tizaru b'zeh. He warns them. Kaddish, good, but remember, it has to come with the study of Torah. If you do not study Torah, don't even bother saying the Kaddish. I mean, this is incredible language, and I think a very important message of what is considered important. You know, by the way, in this tzava that is presented in his will, he warns his children not to join the rabbin. It's a very interesting one, but not what we're going to be focusing on right now. What we do have here, the importance of the study of Torah. Now, I share it because, unfortunately, there's a lot of literature that is known as Kaddish fighting literature. Are you familiar with Kaddish fighting literature? So let me tell you about what Kaddish fighting literature is. Kaddish fighting literature is that in the past, still about 300 years ago, there was an appreciation for the value of the Kaddish, which we're not minimizing, God forbid. It is important, right? We're sanctifying, we're making a statement and declaring that there's a higher being, very important. So people wanted to say the Kaddish, but unfortunately, in many situations, there was more than one person that needed to say the Kaddish. So you had to come up with a compromise. But each person felt, what do you mean? I'm not going to compromise. It's for my father's neshama. I want to benefit my father's neshama. I want to get that extra Kaddish. The other party felt the same. So unfortunately, there were fights. Now, think about the absurdity. You want to benefit the soul of someone that's in the Olam HaNeshamot, in the world of spirits and souls, where we as Jews know the most important thing is Shalom, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Uyaseh Shalom Aleinu. So what do you do to go ahead and benefit that neshama? What do? Fight. Fight. And by the way, there are even records of physical fights to benefit the neshama. That is an absurdity that is the byproduct of making this very important day something external. It's external, meaning you treat it like any other day. You go to shul, you think you'll say a few Kaddishes, right? And poof, mission accomplished, and you act like a Jew shouldn't be acting. The absurdity of fights. And by the way, the issue of fights were so significant that the tradition we are familiar with today, that everyone says Kaddish together, was only the byproduct of avoiding fights. You know, I'll share with you something interesting. That in German communities, in many German communities, they did not have this practice of everyone saying Kaddish together, but one person would say it. However, when there was a cholera outbreak in the 1830s, and unfortunately there were many people saying Kaddish, they turned to the great Rabbi Akiva Eger, and they say to him, listen, to avoid fights, can you give a green light that at least for this year, we could follow the practice that is done in some Polish communities where everyone says Kaddish together. So Rabbi Akiva Eger said, listen, I'm against the concept, it's new, but for the sake of peace, for 1 year, we're going to allow it. When you allow something for 1 year, you know what happens? It remained the practice. He wasn't able to cancel it afterwards. So the idea is that Kaddish, unfortunately, became a reason to fight. I got to benefit my dad's neshama. I'm going to punch your nose because you're not letting my father benefit. The absurdity of making it something external. And I think it is important to read a statement like what we read from the Ridvaz, a statement that reminds us there are things we do that are more valuable than fasting. There are things that are more valuable than even the Kaddish. The Torah that reminds you that Shalom is the Iker, the Torah that brings peace in this world and the world to come. These are things we should be focusing on. My father shared with me that when he was saying Kaddish for his mother, he was traveling a lot, giving lectures throughout the world. And it bothered him because he was supposed to be saying Kaddish and he would miss Kaddish. So he went to Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach tells him, listen, you're traveling for a good reason, so obviously continue your travels. And any time that you were supposed to say a Kaddish, study a Mishnah. And my father told me that he got the feeling from Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that the Mishnah is no less valuable than the Kaddish, right? So just let's keep this in mind of what's considered important. Let's not keep it and let's not make it something external. Let's make it meaningful, right? There's the study of Torah. There's the acts of kindness. It's a day of reflecting, realizing we're not here forever. What are we doing? What are we achieving? What good things can we do to have a positive impact? Another example would be there's a tradition of saying a Kel Mola Rachamim. We're all familiar with it. The whole idea of a Kel Mola Rachamim is the following. A person commits to give tzedakah, a tremendous mitzvah. For the benefit of the neshama, once you are giving tzedakah, so you make a declaration that in the merit of the tzedakah, the neshama should benefit. The Kel Mola Rachamim, the Mola as we know it, is secondary. The main thing, obviously, is the commitment to give tzedakah, to assist an institution, to assist those who need, a financial boost, right? To take the worries away from others. That is considered an act that's valuable. A Mola, even without the Mola, you can achieve tremendous things on a Yahrzeit. So we're not trying to minimize the Mola, but don't make it as if it is all about one Kaddish Mola and mission accomplished, right? If you think about it, even the Ner Neshama, which is in a very important tradition, the Ner Neshama, no question about it. It is very possible that it originated from people donating candles to a synagogue, meaning go back 700 years ago and there's poverty, a shul, they want to daven in a shul. It's depressing to daven in a shul with no light. So people would donate a candle, le'ilui nishmas, to benefit the soul that would illuminate a shul. So the candle got its significance. So I would argue that perhaps a more valuable than an Ner Neshama would be that shuls should advertise that for a Yahrzeit, you pay the electrical bill, you pay for the lights when the davening occurs, because that's how it originated. But again, let's not make it external. Realize that there's a bigger picture as it relates to it. Now, I have the tremendous honor and benefit of interacting with people. And due to the fact that we moved around over the years, I've been able to interact with many people, and my learning has not, Baruch Hashem, has not ended. I'm still learning, which is a beautiful thing. Now, my roots are very much in a traditional yeshiva environment. And one of the things that I've developed more of an appreciation as I mature a little bit is the value of social interaction. In other words, the yeshiva environment focuses on Torah study, which is obviously important. As you mature, you realize the value of people getting together. And especially if it's a positive get-together. You know what a positive get-together is? Where every word uttered is thought through beforehand. Will this word make people feel good? Great mitzvah. If not, no. In other words, healthy social interactions, right? A kiddush upstairs, if you remember those, right? A kiddush upstairs, when people would give to benefit a neshama. The kiddush quite often creates that environment, very valuable. You give a boost to someone. Have a conversation with someone that perhaps felt a little bit lonely. A really powerful, meaningful event. Now, with that maturity and understanding that I've progressed with, I've developed more of an appreciation for something known as the tikkun. Tikkun. In other words, if I look through traditional sources, there's no such thing as bringing a bottle of whiskey on a Yahrzeit. No such thing in Ramah. No such thing if I look at sources from 400 years ago. However, as I look through the sources of the past 200 years, there's a lot of emphasis on it. My natural traditional approach would be, hey, it doesn't appear in Shulchan Aruch. What value does it have? With my maturity, I realized that it has a tremendous value. The tikkun. The tikkun. What is the tikkun? People after davening, and again, not now with this issue that we are dealing with, but Bezrat Hashem, as we return, I think the first tikkun that we're going to have here in Shul after we get over Corona, it better be a good bottle, right? But 18-year-old something. I'm not an expert in these things. But the value of tikkun is something I've developed an appreciation. Now, obviously, it has its roots in Hasidic literature. There's a story of a specific Hasidic Rebbe who one time, due to some travels, forgot his mother's Yahrzeit. And he shared that his mother came to him in a dream afterwards. And the Rebbe said, my mother told me, listen, my son, my Yidel, I forgive you for the fact you forgot the Kaddish. I forgive you for the fact that you didn't light a candle. I forgive you for the fact that you didn't study a Mishnah for me. But one thing I don't forgive you, that you forgot my Yahrzeit and you didn't bring a tikkun. This is a Hasidic story. But I see in it the value. I see in it the value. And let me share with you why and why I've developed that appreciation for the tikkun and a source for it. You know, there was a tremendous Torah scholar, originated in Romania, went through the Shoah, landed up in Manchester, England, and his name was Dayan Yitzchak Weiss, Dayan Weiss, and extremely well respected. He had Hasidic roots and respected in all communities. His responsa is quoted hundreds of times due to the fact that he was such a significant authority. There's an interesting story just to mention that he was in Manchester in the 1950s, 1960s. In 1970, the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, decided that he should move to Israel and become the head of the Eida Haredis. The Eida Haredis. So a few of the Satmar Hasidim approached the Rebbe, Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel, and they said, Rabbi Yoel, we have a problem with Rabbi Weiss. He's not enough of a zealot. How can you make him the head of the Eida Haredis? And Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum responded to them, listen, to become a zealot, you could do it in 24 hours. To become a Torah scholar like he is, you can't do that in 24 hours. Let him have the job. That was the response. So this is a cute story of a tremendous Torah scholar, but what I want to focus on is his Hasidic roots and how he spells out and appreciates the idea of a tikkun. And he says the following, you should know, it's important to remember, fasting is not done these days because in his words, Hador Chalash, it's a weaker generation. We feel it. Perhaps 200 years ago, people were able to continue doing everything they would do on a regular day without breakfast. Today, believe me, if I don't have my oatmeal by 10 a.m., my mind's nothing's functioning. We're a weaker generation. We need our Wheaties or I need my oatmeal. And therefore he notes, Ein bekocham litanot. We don't have the strength litanot. So you know what we do instead? We bring a tikkun to shul. You bring that bottle, right? You bring the whiskey. And you should know that by bringing the whiskey and perhaps some kichel, number one, he notes there's an element of tzedakah. There are people, right? There are people, perhaps not in this community, but in other communities, where that little bit of kichel perhaps is their breakfast, and their little bit of whiskey is something they enjoy. And he notes that it is more than it's tzedakah, it's in hachnasat orchim. In other words, he defines hachnasat orchim not to give food to someone who doesn't have food, but to welcome people into your life, to give them that support, that social support. Because when you have what he calls chaburat anashim yachad, when you have people together, when people turn to one another and you give a l'chaim, and the person who's going through the yahrzeit and going through the difficulty, the emotional difficulty of that day, others turn to him and say, neshama should have an aliyah. They give words of encouragement. There's a feeling of appreciation and unity. You have the achdut, the unity and re'ut. You should know that is what does good for the neshama, because you are supporting the living and doing something honorable for those who are no longer here. You know, there's a section in the Talmud where the Talmud tells us that you should know things that are not rational are called darkei ha'emori. It's like a pagan practice. In other words, to go ahead and do something that's not rational is something we avoid. This is what the Talmud talks about. Now, the Talmud goes ahead and provides for us a list of things that great rabbis did. And if a great rabbi did it, don't worry, it's not darkei ha'emori. It does not have residual paganism in its roots. And the rabbis share with us that there was a tradition that when people would drink some wine, they would say, Chamra v'chaye lefum rabanan. They would lift some wine and they would turn to one another and they would say, wine and life to the mouth of the sages. In other words, what we call a l'chaim. Now, commentators have different explanations as to what's the significance, but what many of them take is the idea that when you go ahead, right, and lift a cup of something that brings pleasure to another person, and it's done together with others, there is an emotional boost that you give to the other person. That is what we should be doing on a yahrzeit. In other words, yes, the yahrzeit has something for the neshama, and we talked about benefiting the neshama and studying Torah for the neshama, and yes, saying a kaddish for the neshama, and yes, doing acts of kindness. But remember the living as well. And you know what benefits the living more than anything else? Connecting to others. We are beings that need that support from others. And when you have that gathering, it's a kiddush and shul, and you go over to the person and you ask them a little bit how many years that has been, or you could perhaps even share a memory of the parent, or share something how you were inspired by that individual. That tikkun, that kiddush, that lechaim, boy, could that be doing lots of good for the neshama, but for the living as well. That's what we have to keep in mind. So that's a little bit of what I would like to offer as my understanding of what a yahrzeit is and what it means to me, what's considered important. And I think we have to remember, let's not keep it external. Let's keep it real, and let's keep the unity, right? That's perhaps the greatest goal as we rebuild shuls and societies. Let's build it in a way of shalom, in a peaceful way where we appreciate one another, right? I think we'll have a different attitude when we're going to face many people in a group together, right? We're going to be together with many, many people, Be'ezras Hashem. Let's view it as something that this is valuable. We didn't have it for a period of time. That gives a boost to a person, and that's what we are all about. I'm going to go ahead and look a little bit at a few of the comments if I'm able to find them, but I don't know if I am finding them or not. Okay, for some reason they disappeared. I would like to thank our sponsors again. It was it's much appreciated. Neshamas should benefit, no doubt. We did learn words of Torah here, so we do thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.